Welcome, everybody, to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. For those who are among us who were here 2 weeks ago, they would have had their minds blown by some major research that Magdalena had shared pertaining to how the U.S., where did this imperial turn that has tainted U.S. history and world history, where did it come from? And what surprised me is that she locked in the notion, the concept of the origins of this Teutonic Aryan mythos, founded as it is upon garbage make-believe, but really having a very strong academic veneer that got a revival in the 18th and into the 19th century that was really behind this perversion of the dream of manifest destiny as being something premised around the idea of spreading the best of civilization to everyone with a concept that I think we've all come to be introduced to, that humankind is made in the living image of a creator, and that we all have the inalienable rights to participate in that unfolding of creation by expressing the best of ourselves possible. That high, beautiful idea that gave rise to the American Revolution was perverted, and the gateway through which its perversion came, as Magdalena went through so beautifully, was through this fictitious belief of some weird, pure blood Teutonic deep past that people like Teddy Roosevelt became really convinced he was a high priest and warrior designed to defend and improve upon that, even throughout his days of promoting eugenics, as well as broader imperialism more generally, and slavery, or the slave institution internationally. So that was just a gorgeous class. Magdalena promised that was just sort of the teaser for the substance, the next, for what she's going to say today. For that to make sense, she had to go through that 2 weeks ago. And for those who might have missed that class, go to the description box under this video. You'll find a link to it. Check it out. Study it. I've rewatched it twice. It's amazing. It also plays in very nicely to some of Cynthia's research on the fictitious creation of Aryanism, the Aryan myth that also gave rise and inspired so many Nazis and others in the 20th century. So fantastic. Today, Magdalena will look at some case studies of how exactly the U.S. made this imperial turn more concretely, with specifics, probably we're going to hear a little bit about the Philippines, some more examples of the perversion of manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America. So like usual, after Magdalena is finished her opus, we're going to open up for some dialogue with the audience. Like usual, just pop your name in the chat box, and I'll call upon you accordingly. I'm looking forward to learning a lot. Magdalena, it is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. All right, let's see here. I'll share. Okay. Hold on. Okay, and I will make this small. All right. So, okay. Very happy to be here, continuing my saga of Teddy Roosevelt and American imperialism, part 2. And as Matt so rightly said, it will be helpful if you are watching part 1, because part 1 is kind of the setup on how the whole ideology developed that we are going to account now in the example of Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines. So as previously, a lot of the information that I'm discussing comes from the book The Imperial Cruise by James Bradley. I would very much recommend for people to read that book. So these are some of the U.S. territorial acquisitions that happened from 1783 on to 1947. And you can see I highlighted the Hawaiian Islands, and I highlighted the Philippine Islands, which we're going to discuss. So up to here is basically up to 1867 about, okay, well, a little bit less. 1853 was westward expansion of the United States, and then we're going to start going into the Pacific and so forth. So manifest destiny was a phrase coined in 1845. It's the idea that the United States is destined by God, its advocates believed, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. The philosophy drove 19th century US territorial expansion and was used to justify the forced removal of Native Americans and other groups from their homes. So by the time Texas was admitted to the Union as a state in December 1845, this idea that the United States must expand westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean had taken a firm hold among the different regions, classes, and political persuasions of the United States. By 1892, 50 years later, in the presidential elections then, the Republican platform proclaimed, we reaffirm our approval of the Monroe Doctrine and believe in the achievement of the manifest destiny of the Republic in its broadest sense. And after the Republicans recaptured the White House in 1896, and for the next 16 years, they held on to it, manifest destiny was cited to promote overseas expansion. You'll start with Hawaii, as my husband says, I should say. So Hawaii, what you had is you had very daring seafarer all the way coming from the Philippines, from Southeast Asia, and they island hopped until they reached Tonga and Samoa groups of islands 1,000 years later. These were expert seafarers. Their canoes were guided to their destination by an elite fraternity of navigators, taught from childhood to read nautical information in a host of natural signs. They knew the year-round positions of more than 150 stars and had a vast knowledge of ocean currents, prevailing winds, and the habits of migratory birds. When nearing islands beyond the horizon, they could actually smell land, feel echoes in the water from swells bouncing off atolls, and see the greenish reflection of forests on the underside of clouds. These were the ancestors of the Hawaiian people. So in 1778, Captain James Cook discovers the island of Hawaii, and he named it the Sandwich Islands after the Earl of Sandwich, his sponsor. In 1778, Hawaiians had a greater life expectancy than their European contemporaries. They were about above the middle size, strong and well-made, and of a dark copper color. Upon the whole, a fine, handsome set of people whose abandoned stock of children promised a plentiful supply for the next generation. This was from observers on James Cook's ship. So there were more than 1 million people on the Hawaiian Islands in Captain Cook's time. But 50 years later, this had been reduced to 130,000 people. This was a missionary census. And the cause of that was diseases spread by the people, the Captain Cook's people, the Europeans coming. The cause was typhus, typhoid fever, measles, smallpox, bronchitis, whooping cough, tuberculosis, venereal disease. So it was not good. So this is a map of James Cook, the map of Hawaii, or the map of the Sandwich Islands. And with Cook and his people came the missionaries. These quotes are just beliefs of some missionaries. I don't want to throw them all in the same kettle, okay? So one missionary wrote that Hawaiian deaths were like the amputation of deceased members of the body. And a popular American magazine said, the experience of the Polynesian and of the American Indians has proved that the Aboriginal races under the present philanthropic system of Christianization were unable to change their habits of life as required by present Christian systems. And Mark Twain joked caustically that Hawaiians suffered from various complicated diseases and education and civilization, and Twain proposed to send a few more missionaries to finish them off. So Hawaii had fertile soil, constant sunshine, plentiful rain, easy access to good ports. It's a sugar producer's dream. And the large-scale sugar production required high-level financial and government contacts back in the United States. So the educated American missionaries that came to Hawaii offered Hawaii to Washington and Wall Street. Especially there was one famous missionary, Reverend Amos Cook, was born in Danbury, Connecticut, educated at Yale, so probably heard all the Anglo-Saxon nonsense. Followed the son to Hawaii in 1837. He ran the Royal School to educate the future kings and queens of Hawaii. And he agreed, or he got the Hawaiian king to agree so that he could sit on the king's special board as an unofficial advisor. And then he advocated to get title to valuable Hawaiian land. Actually, this whole position that he had was quite dubious because the American Board of Missionaries had rules against their missionaries serving in government positions. And in addition to this, the king had been Cook's pupil as well. So, okay, not quite kosher here. So buying land was complicated since native Hawaiians had little notion of private property or cash exchange. They had great difficulty understanding how a transaction, or anything else for that matter, could deprive them of land. And so very similar to the native Indians' beliefs that land belonged to everybody and not just to single landholders. So Cook helped convince King Kamehameha III to institute a revolutionary land reform. Whoever had money could buy as much land as he wanted. Huh. Okay. So the missionary became planters. In 1851, Cook, along with fellow missionary Samuel Castle, founded the Castle and Cook Company, which quickly became the third largest company in Hawaii. One of Hawaii's largest landowners, one of the world's largest sugar producers, and one of the infamous Big Five companies that controlled the Hawaiian government with an iron fist. So the problem was there was labor needed. Hawaiians were considered to be poor candidates for hard labor due to their casual ways. And if Hawaii would have been settled in the 18th century, you could have imported slaves. However, okay, so the whites, they were called haoles by the native Hawaiians. They brought in contract labor from China and Japan, who were bound to serve at fixed wages for 3 to 5 years. And it became a demographic challenge because you had 5,000 white haoles versus 100,000 native Hawaiians and imported Japanese and Chinese people. So the haoles, the whites, opposed democracy for Hawaii, realizing that suffrage, even just male suffrage, would create a government of non-whites. Can't have that. Remember, Anglo-Saxon belief was, okay, that only white people can run a country perfectly. So in 1874, Hawaii signs a treaty with the United States granting the U.S. exclusive trading rights. And in December of that year, the King of Hawaii is the first reigning king to visit the United States, and he was received by President Grant. You can see the picture on the bottom here. The Navy Department described Hawaii as the crossroad of the Pacific, a link to the commerce of Asia. With a supply of coal well guarded at Pearl Harbor, our warships and merchantmen can cross the Pacific at maximum speed or concentrate at distant points at high speed. In 1875, the Reciprocity Treaty eliminated tariffs on Hawaiian sugar. This was forced down the throats of native Hawaiians. And it included a provision that granted the United States exclusive rights to maintain military bases in Hawaii, especially Pearl Harbor. This treaty caused violent street protests. The king requested American protection. The United States sent 150 Marines. So over the next decades, the sugar exports soared. They increased economic power and political influence. However, not for the benefit of the Hawaiian people. Nearly all important government positions are held by Americans, and the islands are really an American colony. So, believing that only the white man could efficiently rule, the Haoles sought to overthrow the monarchy as a form of Aryan patriotism. They referred to themselves as a morally righteous group. They founded the Reform Party in 1887. The native Hawaiians called it the Missionary Party because of its origin. And for muscle, the Missionary Party established an all-white vigilante organization, the Honolulu Rifles. On July 6, 1887, the Honolulu Rifles seized Iolani Palace and handed King Kalakaua a new constitution called the Bayonet Constitution, reducing the king to a mere figurehead. It's called the Bayonet Constitution because the king was forced to accept it at the point of a bayonet. The constitution rejiggered voting rights with new property and income requirements. As a result, there was a total exclusion of Asian as voters. 3/4 of the votes went to the whites, 1/4 to the natives. American citizens could take an oath to support the new Hawaiian Constitution, vote in local elections, and hold office without losing their American citizenship. Nowhere else in the world could American citizens pledge allegiance to another country while still retaining their U.S. citizenship. So Benjamin Harris was elected president in the same year, 1889, that the Missionary Party gained control of the Hawaiian government. And he appointed James Blaine, who promoted the seizure of Hawaii for years as his Secretary of State. Blaine wrote to Harrison, I think there are only 3 places that are of value enough to be taken that are not continental. One is Hawaii, and the others are Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico are not now imminent and will not be for a generation. Hawaii may come up for decision at any unexpected hour, and I hope we shall be prepared to decide it in the affirmative, meaning annex it. At the time, the U.S. Navy was still quite behind the major naval powers. The Navy consisted of old wooden ships. So, the U.S. Army had brought the Aryans to the Pacific coast, taking over the land, but now it had to pass on the baton to the U.S. Navy. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was the president of the newly founded Naval War College, lectured about the need for U.S. expansion to seek the welfare of the country. And he published 2 books in 1890s, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History from 1660 to 1783, and the influence of sea power upon the French Revolution and the Empire from 1793 to 1812. The groundbreaking first book made Mahan the best-known American naval officer and the Naval War College an internationally respected institution. Mahan preached offensive mission. The U.S. Navy should seize strategic world ports, each one a link in the chain of exchange by which wealth accumulates. The United States, he stated, could experience British-style imperial greatness by concentrating its naval power at the links or pressure points of international commerce. By striking quickly and sharply at any of these nerve centers, the U.S. could paralyze whole oceans. To bring Asian booty back to the U.S., Captain Mahan said, the U.S. Navy must establish links in the Pacific, cut a canal through Central America, and turn the Caribbean into an American lake. So back in 1812, Theodore Roosevelt published his first major literary work, The Naval War of 1812. And this book later becomes required reading at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. So in 1889, the U.S. Navy was rated 12th among the navies of the world. The first one, of course, was Great Britain. Then you had the Spanish. You also had French. Okay. So in 1890, Theodore Roosevelt reviewed Mahan's book in the Atlantic Monthly, and he called it distinctly the best and most important, also by far the most interesting book on naval history, which has been produced for many a long year. So, okay, in his 1890 work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Mahan suggested 3 strategies that would assist the United States in both constructing and maintaining an empire. First, noting the sad state of the U.S. Navy, he called for the government to build a stronger, more powerful version. Second, he suggested establishing a network of naval bases to fuel this expanding fleet. Seaworld's previous acquisition of the Midway Islands served this purpose by providing an essential naval coaling station, which was vital as the limited reach of steamships and their dependence on coal made naval coaling stations imperative for increasing the Navy's geographic reach. Future acquisitions in the Pacific and Caribbean increased this naval supply network. So finally, Mahan urged the future construction of a canal across the isthmus of Central America, which would decrease by 2/3 the time and power required to move the new Navy from the Pacific to the Atlantic Oceans. So in 1889, okay, Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Tracy, in his annual report, ranked the American Navy in terms of number of warships behind Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Holland, Spain, Italy/Turkey, China, Norway, Sweden, and Austria, Hungary. So that's how behind America was. So the government moved quickly to heed Mahan's advice. They passed the Battleship Act of 1890, which set production levels for a new modern fleet. Remember, this is influenced by Teddy Roosevelt's book and by Mahan's book. By 1898, the government had succeeded in increasing the size of the U.S. Navy to an active fleet of 160 vessels, of which 114 were newly built of steel. So this is a big breakthrough in industrial capacity or knowledge for shipbuilding, using steel instead of wood. In addition, the fleet now included 6 battleships compared to 0 in the previous decade. As a naval power, the country catapulted to the 3rd strongest in world rankings by military experts, trailing only Spain and Great Britain. So this is a cartoon, okay? I forget it was in Puck magazine or in Life or in Judge magazine, okay? And you can see uh, the different world powers playing poker with their newly built ships. And this is another cartoon by Puck magazine. John Bull, the British, says, "Good heavens, whatever will become of my shipbuilding monopoly if that there Yankee is going to turn out boats like that right along?" Sorry, my British accent is not so good. Maybe I should ask Martin to read it. uh, Wait. So on the left, oops, sorry. On the left, you had John Bull gaping at the new American steamer, and the sign on the shore of England reads, "John Bull, the old reliable shipbuilder since 1861, ships for American commerce a specialty." And on the right, you have Uncle Sam proudly displaying his new steamships and a sign that reads, "Uncle Sam, the shipbuilder, reestablished with great success in 1893, American ships for American commerce." So in Hawaii, okay, after this little detour into shipbuilding, we're returning back to Hawaii. So Queen Liliuokalani ascended to the throne in 1891 upon the death of her brother, King Kalakaua. And she was determined to restore dignity to the Kingdom of Hawaii and power to her people. The New York magazine Judge portrayed her as a demented Indian squaw. You can see it on the right. She decided to promulgate a new constitution, abolish the humiliating bayonet constitution, and restore power to the majority Hawaiians. She informed her cabinet of her plans on January 14th, 1893, and the word leaked out immediately. And this was just her intention. So the missionary party founder, Lauren Thurston, quickly convened a meeting to form a 13-member all-Heoli Committee of Safety. First order of business, Hawaii's annexation to the United States. Over the next 2 days, these 13 people hatched a scheme with the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John Stevens, an old friend of Secretary of State Blaine. And the missionary party members complained to Stevens that they didn't have enough military force to topple the government, the Queen, and they feared arrest. Stevens promised them U.S. Marines aboard the USS Boston anchored in Honolulu Harbor. This is a first, a historical first. An American minister accredited to a sovereign nation conspiring in its overthrow. The Committee of Safety drafted an appeal to Stevens in which they noted the general alarm and terror, the public safety is menaced, and lives and property are in peril. We are unable to protect ourselves without aid, and therefore pray for the protection of the United States forces. After signing this general alarm and terror document, the Committee of Safety adjourned for the day and went for lunch. Business as usual. Minister Stevens boarded the USS Boston at 3 p.m. and handed this written request to her captain. "Sir, in view of existing critical circumstances in Honolulu, indicating an inadequate legal force, I request you to land Marines and sailors from the ship under your command for the protection of the United States legation and the United States consulate, and to secure the safety of American life and property. Very truly yours, John L. Stevens." 1 hour later, 162 heavily armed United States Marines surrounded the royal palace and forced out Queen Liliuokalani. The next day, representing the United States, Stevens recognized the Hawaiian Provisional Government. The new president of Hawaii was Sanford Dole, a son of missionaries. Stevens raised the American flag in Honolulu and declared Hawaii an American protectorate. The new president of Hawaii was Sanford B. Dole. He was a son of missionaries and cousin of the founder of the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, now the Dole Pineapple Company. And John Stevens, U.S. Minister to Hawaii, raised the American flag in Honolulu and declared Hawaii an American protectorate. The new government began enforcing its regime by putting into practice a series of repressive policies to silence its critics. President Dole dispatched 5 missionary party members to Washington. President Harrison proclaimed, "The overthrow of the monarchy was not in any way promoted by this government, and the change of government in Hawaiian Islands was entirely unexpected so far as the United States was concerned." John Foster, the new Secretary of State, said, "At the time the provisional government took possession of the government buildings, no troops or officers of the United States were present or took any part whatever in the proceedings." After 7 meetings over a short 10 days, Secretary of State Foster and the White Hawaiians signed the Annexation Treaty on February 14, 1893. And the next day, Harrison submitted the treaty to the Senate for ratification. President Harrison hoped the senators would approve Hawaii's annexation before the truth came out, but time was against him. He had lost the election in 1892 and had less than a month in office before he would leave. Things started well. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee hastily approved the annexation treaty and sent it to the full Senate on February 17th. That day, however, a visitor appeared with a different story. Paul Newman, the Queen Liliuokalani's personal attorney and envoy. Newman made the case that, number 1, the Queen had been unfairly dethroned. Number 2, Minister Stevens had improperly landed U.S. troops. Remember the lie. Minister Stevens had illegally proclaimed the United States protectorate over the islands. And Native Hawaiians had not been consulted and would not favor a treaty. All of a sudden, you had opposition to the annexation. Suddenly, okay, senators went on record calling the American actions in Hawaii an outrage and an act of war, and they ridiculed annexation as a Hawaiian sugar planter scheme to obtain American bounty. They sought only personal aggrandizement. And the anti-imperialists' objections were that the annexation would constitute a dangerous departure from certain traditional policies of the United States, such as continental expansion and non-interference in the affairs of other nations. In other words, they were quoting the Monroe Doctrine. Okay? So, for example, Burke Cochran, a Democrat from New York, objected to the United States' acquisition of colonial possessions like Hawaii and argued that American supremacy in those islands could and should be maintained without annexing them. Let the people of Hawaii settle their own affairs without meddling from the United States, advised Joseph D. Sayers, a Texas Democrat. President-elect Cleveland met with his future Secretaries of State and of the Treasury, Gresham and Carlisle, on February 22, 1893, to discuss the case of the Hawaiian Queen. Former President Harrison lamented in February 1893, "I am sorry the Hawaiian question did not come 6 months sooner or 60 days later, as it is embarrassing to begin without the time to finish." But Teutonism reared its ugly head again. Many Americans opposed annexing Hawaii, but not for reasons of sympathy. Some claimed that the framers of the Constitution intended the Republic's territorial expansion to be restricted to contiguous land, which would be settled by Americans of Anglo-Saxon lineage. Harper's Weekly wrote, history had shown that Anglo-Saxon democratic institutions could not survive in tropical colonies. So when Grover Cleveland gave his inaugural address of 1885, he had subscribed to the non-entangling anti-colonial policies of the founding fathers. He said in his speech, maintaining as I do the tenets of a line of precedents from Washington's day, which proscribe entangling alliances with foreign states, I do not favor a policy of acquisition of new and distant territory or the incorporation of remote interests with our own. However, and then in March 9th, 1893, Grover Cleveland withdrew the Hawaiian annexation treaty from the Senate for the purpose of re-examination. On March 11, 2 days later, he sent former Congressman James Henderson Blount from Georgia as a special commissioner to Honolulu to investigate the revolution. So he actually went to Honolulu. Blount lowered the American flag in Honolulu on April 1st, 1893, which ended Hawaii's status as a U.S. protectorate. And Blount concluded in his report on July 17th, 1893, United States diplomatic and military representatives had abused their authority and were responsible for the change in government. Minister Stevens was recalled, and the military commander of forces in Hawaii was forced to resign his commission. So far, so good. Okay, and on December 18th, 1893, Cleveland sent a scathing report to Congress. He said, there is little basis for the pretense that forces were landed for the security of American life and property. When these armed men were landed, the city of Honolulu was in its customary, orderly, and peaceful condition. There was no symptom or disturbance in any quarter. Men, women, and children were about the street as usual, and nothing varied the ordinary routine or disturbed the ordinary tranquility, except the landing of the Boston Marines and their march through the town. He said, the provisional government has not assumed a republic or other constitutional form, but has remained a mere executive council or oligarchy set up without the assent of the people. Indeed, the representatives of that government assert that the people of Hawaii are unfit for popular government, and frankly avow that they can be best ruled by arbitrary or despotic power. So, so far so good, but now, Teutonism, Anglo-Saxon, is rearing its ugly head, The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Senator John Taylor Morgan from Alabama, who is a former Confederate general, Grand Dragon of the KKK, and a U.S. senator, he composed, this was Senate Foreign Relations Committee was chaired by him and composed mostly by senators in favor of annexation. And so he initiated their own investigation to discredit Blount's earlier report. They used pro-annexationist affidavits from Hawaii and testimony provided to the U.S. Senate in Washington, D.C. So there was no fact-finding tour. Nobody went to Hawaii. The Morgan report contradicted the Blount report and exonerated Minister Stevens and the U.S. military troops, finding them not guilty of involvement in the overthrow. Regardless, January 1894, President Dole's provisional government celebrated its 1-year anniversary. The missionary party leaders realized that if Cleveland hadn't acted to restore the Queen after 12 months, Hawaii was safely within their white hands. On February 7, 1894, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 177 to 78 with 96 abstentions to condemn Minister Stevens, but nothing was done on the ground in Hawaii. Dole worked hard to make sure the Aryan would now dominate, consulting Teddy's law school mentor, the Columbia professor, John Burgess, regarding a new constitution. He said, in his letter, Dole explained that Hawaii had many natives comparatively ignorant of the principles of government and a menace to good government. Burgess responded, "Oh, if I understand your situation, it is as follows. You have a population of nearly 100,000 persons, of whom about 5,000 are Teutons, i.e. Americans, English, Germans, and Scandinavians. About 9,000 are Portuguese. About 30,000 are Chinese and Japanese. About 8,000 are native born of foreign parents, and the rest are natives. With this situation, I understand your problem to be the construction of a constitution which will place the government in the hands of the Teutons and preserve it there." Dole thanked the professor. "Your letter showed a clear knowledge of our peculiar political circumstances." So the provisional government, Dole, feared that President Cleveland might continue to support the Queen by restoring the monarchy. But they also realized there would be no annexation until Cleveland's term of office ended. They wanted to establish a more permanent government until another president more favorable towards annexation came to office. So they called to order a constitutional convention on May 30th, 1894. And the Constitutional Convention drafted a constitution for a Republic of Hawaii. The Republic of Hawaii was proclaimed on July 4th, 1894 at Aliolani Heiau. The Republic was a single-party oligarchy. Every government with a diplomatic presence in Hawaii, except for the United Kingdom, recognized the provisional government within 48 hours of the overthrow via their consulates. When the Republic of Hawaii was declared on July 4th, 1894, immediate de facto recognition was given by every nation with diplomatic relations with Hawaii, except for Britain, whose response came in November 1894. And you can see here the flag introduced in 1845. And this flag stayed, through the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the Republic of Hawaii, the annexation of Hawaii, and finally the admission of Hawaii as a U.S. state. So you think that, that would be the end of Hawaii as an independent nation, but still there is some breath left there, In 1895, the Wilcox Rebellion, or the counter-revolution of 1895, took place. It was a brief war from January 6th to January 9th, 1895. There were 3 battles on the islands of Oahu, Republic of Hawaii. It was the last major military operation by royalists who opposed the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And the rebellion was named after Robert William Kalanihiapo Wilcox, the military leader of the rebellion. His father, Captain William Wilcox, was an American from Newport, Rhode Island. His mother was a Hawaiian from Maui named Kalua. Through Kalua's father, Macaulay, Wilcox was the great-great-great-great-grandson of the late 17th century Hawaiian king, and don't ask me to say that name, okay? Wilcox later became the first delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives from Hawaii, and he served from 1900 to 1903. So all royalist leaders had been arrested by the United States military by January 16th, when Queen Liliuokalani was taken into custody at Washington Place and imprisoned in Iloani Palace. Wilcox was arrested and tried for treason. He was convicted much in February 1895 and was sentenced to death with 5 other leaders. But then some were freed due to giving testimony against the others, and Wilcox's sentence was commuted to 35 years in prison. And then finally, on January 1st, 1898, he was pardoned by Sanford B. Dole, President of the Republic. So how did this happen? Well, Dole had previously pressured Queen Liliuokalani to abdicate in exchange for Wilcox's life and freedom, as well as for the lives of the others who had been sentenced to death. And that's what she did. In order to preserve the life and the freedom for Wilcox and others, she agreed to abdicate. And Hawaii would remain, as Cleveland had described it, an oligarchy set up without the assent of the people. Theodore Roosevelt was outraged that Cleveland had not proudly followed the son to Hawaii. In 1896, Teddy Roosevelt fumed in Century magazine. He said, "We should annex Hawaii immediately. It was a crime against the United States. It was a crime against white civilization not to annex it 2.5 years ago. The delay did damages that is perhaps irreparable, for it meant that at the critical period of the island's growth, the influx of population consisted not of white Americans, but of low-caste laborers from the yellow races." Showing his true colors once again. So Liliuokalani and other political leaders were tried and convicted for misprision of treason, okay, by those who had overthrown the kingdom. And that was the end of the Hawaiian monarchy. McKinley had become president on March 4th, 1897. Teddy Roosevelt had become Assistant Secretary of the Navy on April 6th, 1897. And on July 4th, 1898, by passing the Newlands Resolution, the United States officially annexed Hawaii, and the Republic's President Dole was appointed provisional governor. So here is William McKinley. He is a reluctant supporter of annexation. However, he lobbied Congress to act, warning that to do nothing would invite a royalist counter-revolution or a Japanese takeover. I think that was put into his head by Teddy Roosevelt. He foresaw a difficulty in getting 2/3 of the Senate to approve a treaty of annexation. So instead, he supported the efforts of Democratic Representative Francis Newland from Nevada to accomplish the same, okay, by a joint resolution of both houses of Congress. And the Newland resolution passed both houses by wide margins, and McKinley signed it into law on July 8, 1898. And he said, "We need Hawaii just as much and a good deal more than we did California. It is manifest destiny." However, there was still opposition opposing views of annexation. This is a quote from Pettigrew, Richard Franklin Pettigrew, who's a United States Senator from South Dakota. This is a speech that was printed in the Herald newspaper in Los Angeles. So um, I found it interesting that a West Coast newspaper would cover what a South Dakota senator had to say. He said, the American flag went up on Hawaii in dishonor. It came down in honor. And if it goes up again now, it will go up in infamy and shame, and this government will join the robber nations of the world. So, okay. By March 4th, when William McKinley was inaugurated, the situation at police headquarters, remember this is when Teddy Roosevelt was still police commissioner, head of the police commissioners in New York City, okay? It was a terrible situation, lots of graft, lots of corruption at that place. The situation at police headquarters had become an open scandal. The newspapers that day carried reports of an almost total breakdown of discipline in the force, new outbreaks of corruptions, tearful threats of resignation, and Roosevelt was in the middle of it. So this could not bode well. So knowing this, Roosevelt and his friends furiously lobbied for his appointment with McKinley, okay? His friend, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, wrote to Teddy, the absolute only thing I can hear adverse is that there is a fear that you will want to fight somebody at once. And despite that, April 6th, in 1897, Theodore Roosevelt was nominated for Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he had promised the Secretary of the Navy, John Long, that he would be entirely loyal and subordinate. Though to his sister, Roosevelt confided, I am a quietly rampant Cuba Libre man. So on April 26th, 1897, okay, Theodore Roosevelt gave President McKinley a memo with 4 warnings of possible trouble with Cuba. This was the beginning of his pro-war campaign. At the time, the nerve center of American strategic planning was the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And Assistant Secretary Teddy Roosevelt, he is in office only 7 weeks, went to Newport to address the War College planners. He delivered a powerful peace through strength speech. He used the word war 62 times, approximately once a minute. And this speech caused a nationwide sensation when it was printed in major newspapers. The Washington Post wrote, Theodore Roosevelt, you have found your place at last. The Baltimore Sun, manly, patriotic, intelligent, and convincing. So here you see Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt on the steps of the Naval War College with faculty and students. Okay, the Naval War College planners got the message, and on June 30th, 1897, they submitted to Washington a plan to wage war on Spain that stated hostilities would take place mainly in the Caribbean, but the U.S. Navy would also attack the Philippines. So this was planned. September 1897, Teddy Roosevelt met with McKinley 3 times as acting Secretary of the Navy. Secretary Long was out of town. He gave McKinley a memorandum in which he advocated immediate war and recommended that the U.S. take and retain the Philippines. He also lobbied Congress. Representative Butler, a member of the House Naval Affairs Committee, remembered, Roosevelt came down here looking for war. He did not care whom we fought as long as there was a scrap. And in a letter to a West Point professor, Roosevelt wrote, in strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. So when Secretary John D. Long left for vacation, Roosevelt went to work preparing the Navy for war. He was pretty much in control of the Navy Department, although only temporarily. Roosevelt worked vigorously until he left to go to war himself in 1898. So he signed orders to allow for general maneuvers by the North Atlantic Squadron, went aboard ships for gunnery practice, investigated the management of Navy yard facilities, pushed for the installation of rapid-fire weaponry throughout the fleet, wined and dined key senators and congressmen to secure funding and support, fired Navy Department personnel who did not meet minimum fitness report marks, directed the rewriting of war plans, inspected battleships of Sandy Hook, ordered munitions and armor, initiated a public relations campaign, set up boards to investigate ways of relieving chronic dry dock shortages, made regularly trips to the White House where he educated President McKinley in strategy, and additionally, Roosevelt ensured that his man, Commodore George Dewey, received command of the Asiatic Squadron. And this was arguably one of the most important orders given, okay? Roosevelt seized the opportunity while acting secretary and being sure that war was now inevitable, prepared for aggressive offensive operations in the Pacific. He wrote, order the squadron accept the Monocacy to Hong Kong. Keep full of coal. In the event of declaration of war with Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations in Philippine Islands. Keep Olympia until further orders. Thus, Roosevelt set up the Battle of Manila and the takeover of the Philippines. But first, he had to take over, quote, liberate, end of quote, Cuba. So, Cuba was, Spain was controlled by, Cuba was controlled by Spain, and so was the Philippines, among other things, okay? So by the 1890s, you had a generation of young nationalists who had arisen around the globe to reclaim their homelands from the white Christian colonial powers. Spain was battling insurrections in both its Cuban and Philippines colonies at the same time. After the Cuban Revolution broke out in 1895, Americans began to align with the revolutionaries. Reports of Cuban civilians being put into concentration camps to separate them from revolutionaries and prevent them from providing aid to the rebellion became common. Within 2 years, the concentration centers were being labeled death camps. The U.S. interest in purchasing Cuba had began long before 1898. And I want to refer you to Tony Jakin's newest book, where he has a whole chapter in there about these attempts of getting hold of Cuba. Following the 10 Years' War, American sugar interests bought up large tracts of land in Cuba. Alterations in the U.S. sugar tariff favored homegrown beet sugar, and that helped foment the rekindling of revolutionary fervor in 1895 in Cuba. By that time, the U.S. had invested more than $50 million in Cuba, and annual trade, mostly in sugar, was worth twice that much. So Tony's chapter, okay, is called How America's Enemies Organized the Sovereign Slave Empire. And I recommend it highly. It's in the book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 2, which just came out a week ago, 1830s to 1890s. So when Spain when Spain suffered, I guess, maybe you could say suffered, okay, through the uprising of the Cuban people, the Cuban natives, okay, they sent General Weyler, his nickname is the Butcher, to Cuba in 1896. And he implemented the first wave of this reconcentration policy that sent thousands of Cubans into concentration camps. Under Weyler's policy, the rural population had 8 days to move into designated camps located in fortified towns. Any person who failed to do so was shot. The housing in these areas was typically abandoned, decaying, roofless, virtually inhabitable. Food was scarce, and famine and disease quickly swept through the camps. By 1898, 1/3 of Cuba's population had been forcibly sent into the concentration camps. Over 400,000 Cubans died as a result of the Spanish Reconciliation policy. So this was covered in the American press, okay? Here's an article on Weyler in Cuba on the left, okay? Spanish continuous atrocities in Cuba. You had Puck and Judge magazine portraying the Cuban people as an innocent young maiden, okay, that needs protection from the Spanish lecherous man. You can see that on the right, okay, and you see on the bottom here again this young innocently dressed maiden in the frying pan of Spanish misrule. So there was a big propaganda campaign to portray the Cuban people in a sympathetic light, but you also notice they're being portrayed as young white ladies, okay, innocent ladies that needs protection, which is a nice effort on manipulation. So President Grover Cleveland had proclaimed neutrality on June 12, 1895, but then by December that same year, he reversed himself, declaring that the United States might intervene should Spain fail to end the crisis in Cuba. And then what happened is that the New York Journal published a copy of a letter from Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Dupuy de Lom criticizing the American president on February 9, 1898. And a very, very short time later, this letter created a big scandal because they called McKinley all kinds of names, okay? 6 days later, there was an explosion aboard the USS Maine that was docked in Havana's harbor. And on April 21st, 1898, President McKinley ordered a blockade of Cuba, and 4 days later, the United States declared war against Spain. So McKinley was the 25th president of the United States, okay? And he was the last president to have served in the Civil War. And the war left an indelible impression on him. He was very much against war. There is talk about how he was pacing the White House and at night and couldn't sleep and had to take sedatives because he couldn't sleep because of the anxiety about having to make war. However, his economic policies, his internal policies were excellent. High protective tariffs and pro-industrial policies led to an unprecedented economic growth. His critics called him the representative of the trusts. He rejected free silver, expansionary monetary policy, and secured the establishment of the gold standard. Okay. And McKinley said about Cuba, I have been through one war, I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another. So, okay, the American press went on a campaign. The Atlanta Constitution ridiculed McKinley as a goody-goody man, calling for a declaration of American virility. At this moment, there is a great need of a man in the White House. The people need a man, an American, at the helm. The New York Journal sought any signs, however faint, of manhood in the White House. The New York World editorialized, there are manly and resolute ways of dealing with treachery and wrong. There are unmanly and irresolute ways. And Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt remarked to a friend, McKinley has no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. So a very nasty public campaign against Kinley to force him to go along with this war. And when the USS Maine exploded, okay, you can see here, it says Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. However, later on, the captain of the Maine said that he thinks it was an accident because of the ammunitions being stored right beside the boiler room. And if something happened to the boiler, then obviously the whole ship would be blowing up. But anyway, this incident with the Maine later on created this slogan, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. So McKinley finally buckled under the increased pressure for him to go to war. And on April 11, 1898, requested a declaration of war from the Senate. And he says in it, I'm only in the highlighted part. First, in the cause of humanity and to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries now existing there, in which the parties to the conflict are either unable or unwilling to stop or mitigate. It is no answer to say this is all in another country, belonging to another nation, and is therefore none of our business. It is specially our duty, for it is right at our door. And the present conditions of affairs in Cuba is a constant menace to our peace and entails upon this government an enormous expense. So to make it more palatable, okay, the Teller Amendment was added to McKinley's war resolution. And this Teller Amendment declared benevolent intentions. It said, the people of the island of Cuba are, of right ought to be, free and independent. United States does hereby demand that the government of Spain at once relinquish its authority and government in the island of Cuba. And the United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for the pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. And with that, the war resolution went through. So, okay, back in April 1897, Teddy Roosevelt was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by McKinley, and he promoted war readiness in an anticipated conflict with Spain. Then in May 1898, he resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to join the 1st U.S. Voluntary Cavalry Regiment to deploy in Cuba. He actually was put in charge of creating this U.S. Voluntary Cavalry Regiment. And he and his friend Leonard Wood, okay, who he had been friends with, went together and they formed the Rough Riders. They went out to recruit. They went to Texas and other places to recruit, okay, this ragtag group of polo players, hunters, cowboys, Native Americans, and athletic college buddies to have an adventure, okay, in Cuba. And they called themselves the Rough Riders. And the conflict there lasted from May to July 1898. So here's Rough Rider Teddy, okay? Um, so he so this highly publicized stint as leader of a regiment of volunteers in the Spanish-American War, he became known as Colonel Roosevelt, the manly advocate of virile imperialism. Never again would Roosevelt's name be linked to effeminacy. Even today, historians invoke Roosevelt as the quintessential symbol of turn-of-the-century masculinity. Remember, okay, he had fought this all his life, and he used media and he used advertising to change this image from a weakling, okay, to a masculine Christianity supporter. Okay, so here is Teddy Roosevelt in his Rough Rider uniform. It was tailored by Brooks Brothers. So the Rough Riders participated in two important battles in Cuba. The first action they saw occurred at the Battle of Las Guasimas on June 24th, where the Spanish were driven away. And then the Battle of San Juan Heights was fought on July 1st, which Roosevelt called the great day of my life. He led a series of charges up Kettle Hill towards San Juan Heights on his horse, Texas, while the Rough Riders followed on foot. So he was the only one on horse. Because they actually had lots of horses planned to bring to Cuba, but then there was a mishap in Florida when they were loading up the horses and the ammunitions and everything else, and they didn't have enough ships, so they had to leave the horses behind. Okay, so the Rough Riders' charge on Kettle Hill was facilitated by a hail of high-caliber covering fire from 3 Gatling guns, commanded by Lieutenant John Parker, and he fired his group fired some 18,000 army rounds into the Spanish trenches atop the crest of both hills, which was very conveniently neglected when Roosevelt tells the story. According to Roosevelt, he and his troops were solely responsible for getting up on the hill. So Roosevelt's political career ignited as he returned a war hero and national celebrity because, of course, he made sure that his version of events was published in all the relevant newspapers. So he charged on horseback to victory at Kettle Hill and San Juan Heights, and he continued riding that horse all the way to governor of New York and then vice president just 3 years later. So a well-placed advertising campaign as hero of Cuba then brought him to the governor position in New York and vice president just very little time later. So here is Teddy Roosevelt in his Brooks Brothers uniform, bottom left, up on top of the hill, and here on his horse here, okay, leading his troops up the hill. Roosevelt thought were of how he would help score the first great triumph of a mighty world movement. And this is what he had to say about the Cubans. Now remember how the media in the United States portrayed the Cubans to get the support for them, okay? And this is now Roosevelt's words now. The Cuban soldiers were almost all blacks and mulattoes and were clothed in rags and armed with every kind of old rifle. They were utterly unable to make a serious fight or to stand against even a very inferior number of Spanish troops, but we hoped that they might be of some use as scouts and skirmishers. For various reasons, this proved not to be the case, and so far as the Santiago campaign was concerned, we should have been better off if there had not been a single Cuban with the army. They accomplished literally nothing, while they were a source of trouble and embarrassment and consumed much provisions. Of course, he's also not saying, okay, that it was the Cuban revolutionaries who kept the Spanish at bay when the Americans landed their ships at the harbor to unload the weapons and horses, etc., etc. So they were good for that, but then good for nothing else, according to Roosevelt. So 100 years later, Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor by President Bill Clinton for what was described as acts of bravery on July 1st, 1898, near Santiago de Cuba, Republic of Cuba, while leading a daring charge up San Juan Hill. On August 12, 1898, I'm not saying anything more about what President Clinton said and did, okay? It's quite... Anyway. On August 12, 1898, the Spanish government surrendered to the United States and agreed to an armistice that relinquished their control of Cuba. The armistice also gained the United States the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This large acquisition of land elevated, or I believe denigrated, the United States to the level of an imperial power. The Spanish-American War also began a trend of the United States intervention in foreign affairs, which has lasted to the present day. So, the Platt Amendment, okay, this was approved in Congress on March 2nd, 1901. The Platt Amendment was a treaty between the United States and Cuba. As soon as the United States got control of Cuba, the Congress passed the Platt Amendment, which canceled the benevolent intentions expressed in the original war resolution. No Cubans were allowed to confer on the surrender of Spain or to sign it. So they were not involved. They were not asked, okay, to participate in this at all. This was solely between Spain and the United States. So down came the Spanish flag in Cuba and up went the Stars and Stripes. After becoming military governor of Cuba, Leonard Wood of the Rough Riders admitted to Roosevelt, "There is, of course, little or no independence left Cuba under the Platt Amendment." So what is this Platt Amendment? Okay. It prohibited the Cuban government from entering into any international treaty that would compromise Cuban independence or allow foreign powers to use the island for military purposes. The United States also reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs in order to defend Cuban independence and to maintain a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. It demanded that the Cuban government implement plans to improve sanitary conditions on the island, which is not a bad thing. Okay. It relinquished claims on the island, Isle of Pine. Okay. The Platt Amendment agreed to sell or lease territory for coaling and naval stations to the United States. This clause ultimately led to the perpetual lease by the United States of Guantanamo Bay. And finally, the amendment required the Cuban government to conclude a treaty with the United States that would make the Platt Amendment legally binding. So this was done in 1903 after McKinley died and while Teddy was president. And the United States pressured the Cubans to incorporate the terms of the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution. Because of the Platt Amendment, this was the reason why the United States intervened in Cuban affairs in 1906, 1912, 1917, and 1920s. And by 1934, you had rising Cuban nationalism and widespread criticism of the Platt Amendment. And that resulted in its repeal as part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's good neighbor policy towards Latin America. However, the United States still retained its lease on Guantanamo Bay, where the naval base remains in operation today. And of course, we all know about the famous Guantanamo Bay acts during after 9/11. So this is how the Cubans saw it on the left, the Platt Amendment, and the branding of the U.S. of the sugarcane workers, Cuban sugarcane workers. Okay, and on the right, which was in one publication in the United States. So Leonard Wood, General Leonard Wood, who was commander of the U.S. occupation forces and military governor of Cuba, presented the terms of the Platt Amendment to the delegates of the Cuba Constitutional Convention in the late 1900s. So the Cuban people wanted to create their own convention or constitution, and the Cuban delegates realized that the amendment significantly limited Cuban sovereignty, and they originally refused to include it within their constitution. But the US government promised them a trade treaty that would guarantee Cuban sugar export access to the US market. And there were several failed attempts by the Cubans to reject or modify the terms of the Platt Amendment. But finally, they had to give in, okay? And they succumbed to the American pressure, and they ratified it on June 12, 1901, by a vote of 16-11. And as I said, the Platt Amendment remained in force until 1934, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt got rid of it. So, going back a little bit again, September 1898, Teddy is now back from Cuba, okay? Rough Rider fame, he's being glorified, okay, as the big hero. And he was nominated by the Republican Party for governor of New York State. And even you can see here, he has his Rough Rider hat on his button, okay? He gets elected governor of New York, served until the end of 1900, so just about, okay, not quite 2 years. And then on November 6, 1900, is elected vice president. And here you can see a campaign poster, okay? McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, okay? And you can see it says the administration's promises have been kept. On the left, you see 1896, okay? The factories are still, there's no smoke coming out of them because it has gone democratic, okay? There was a run on the bank, okay, which I talked about last in my first section, okay? And there's Spanish rule in Cuba. But then in 1900s, okay, because of Republican, the chimneys are smoking again. The farmers are plowing their fields. There's a run to the bank to deposit your money. And there is American rule and peace in Cuba. And it says, okay, the American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. Which is a quote by McKinley. So by that time now, you had also a lot of cartoons and reports about the rapprochement of Britain, okay, Great Britain and United States. Like this is a cartoon from Puck magazine. After many years, Britannia says daughter, Columbia says mother. So it just shows, okay, how Britannia, Great Britain, welcomes the United States as an estranged daughter and new imperialist partner. The US entered the elite group of world powers with victories in the Spanish-American War. You can see it in the clouds over the naval battle on the right, okay? Spanish-American War, okay? And in the storm clouds on the left, where it says the Eastern question looms. So, okay, daughter and mother. And here is another one. This poster, also dating from about 1898, celebrating the rapprochement between the United States and Great Britain with particularly dense detail. You can see progress, economic, technological, cultural, is spread through global military aggression. The rays of the sun shine over Uncle Sam and John Bull, okay, who clasp hands in a renewed Anglo-American alliance of kindred interests rooted in the English tongue. Warships on the horizon ground their mission in naval power. Britain, the more powerful military partner, shows celebrated victories over the Spanish Armada in 1588 and over the French and Spanish navies at Trafalgar in 1805. The US is newly victorious in 1898 naval victories over the Spanish at Manila and Santiago de Cuba. Colonial success is equated with chivalry and invincibility. And here's another one, okay? 10,000 miles from tip to tip, meaning the extension of the United States domination, symbolized by the bald eagle, from Puerto Rico to the Philippines. The cartoon contrasts this with a map of the smaller United States of 100 years earlier in 1798. Which brings us to the Philippines. And here's a map where the Philippines is. This it's a cartoon that showed in Judge magazine, okay? And it shows the Philippines merely a stepping stone to China. And I just want to go through the two different views of benevolent intentions. Okay, so President William McKinley, he told visiting Methodist ministers that he fell to his knees and prayed for enlightenment, and that God told him it was his duty to uplift, civilize, and Christianize the Filipinos. And he used the term benevolent intentions into the US foreign policy vocabulary. And he understood that to his electorate, imperialism was a dirty word. He made Americans believe that their nation's boldly imperial moves were instead efforts of great compassion and sacrifice. If the average American felt pity for others, he had a Christian duty to help. Whereas, okay, Theodore Roosevelt's view of benevolent intention, okay, he said in his third volume of his Winning of the West series, this is a quote, "Many good persons seem prone to speak of all wars of conquest as necessary evil. This is, of course, a short-sighted view. In its after effects, a conquest may be fraught either with evil or with good for mankind, according to the comparative worth of the conquering and conquered peoples." So at the time, Philippine society uh, was had some different sections. Okay, on the one hand, you had the class of ilustrados, okay, which is a class of educated individuals, i.e., people like Jose Rizal, who is you can see him here on the right, who was Philippines' national poet. He was educated in Spain, Filipino, but educated in Spain. And they supported independence of the Philippines, but most of the ilustrados opposed a military revolution. You had conservative religious orders in the Philippines. You had a group called the Katipunan. Okay, this was created in 1892 by radical members of the La Liga Filipina. Now, La Liga Filipina was founded by Jose Rizal. Okay, and so these radical members of La Liga Filipina founded the, you can see the name here, okay, a group simply called the Katipunan. And these were predominantly members of Manila's urban middle class rather than the ilustrados. And at first, the Katipunan was a secret society. The objective was for Philippines to secede from the Spanish Empire. They advocated complete Philippine independence and began the Philippine Revolution in 1896. When it wasn't a secret society anymore, somebody spilled the beans, okay? And the ilustrados were implicated by the Spanish authorities and were arrested and imprisoned. And in December of 1896, Jose Rizal, the leader of the Ilustrados and founder of the Liga Filipina, who had disapproved of a military revolution, was executed. And because of that, okay, the Spanish thought they got rid of a rebel rouser, okay, but the opposite happened. The rebellion intensified. So in 1897, a conference to unite the different factions of the Katipunan was held, but instead it caused further division, and this led to the execution of Andres Bonifacio, okay, who was then the leader of the Katipunan. But because of him, okay, not doing what the entire group wanted, he was executed. And Bonifacio's death passed the control of the Katipunan over to Emilio Aguinaldo. So the Spanish military was unable to overcome this growing political support for the revolution. There was fighting going on. Okay, in December of 1897, there was finally a provisional constitution was set up by the Spanish. It was set up was supposed to last for 2 years, but it was superseded by an agreement, a truce between the Spaniards and the revolutionary. This truce or this pact provided for Aguinaldo's surrender and exile to Hong Kong, and amnesty and payment of indemnities by the Spaniards to the revolutionaries. So the Spanish basically thought, okay, we ship this guy Emilio Aguinaldo off to Hong Kong, and then we can have some peace. So Emilio Aguinaldo was America's original nemesis in the Philippines. He became mayor of his hometown when he was only 17 years old. And he studied America's Declaration of Independence and Constitution. He dreamt of throwing off the Philippines' Spanish masters. By the 1890s, he was a leading freedom fighter, General Aguinaldo of the Philippine Revolutionary Army. So 21 years old, and he's General Aguinaldo of the Philippine Revolutionary Army. However, his problem was that he wasn't Anglo-Saxon. And according to Professor Burgess of Columbia, most American political intellectual leaders, this disqualified him from leading a state, a job restricted to those with Teutonic blood. And Aguinaldo's biggest mistake was to believe that the United States would support independence for the non-white Filipinos. In 1896, he wrote of an independent Philippines. The form of government will be like that of the United States of America, founded upon the most rigid principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Aguinaldo led the Philippine forces first against Spain in the Philippines Revolution, and then in 1898, the Spanish-American War erupted, and he fought in that, okay? And in 1899 to 1901, he fought against the United States during the Philippine-American War. In January 1897, Aguinaldo appealed to the U.S. State Department. Pray that help be extended to the Filipinos to expel the Spanish by force, just as the Emperor Napoleon helped America in the War of Separation from England, by whose aid the Americans attained independence. And of course, there was no response. But it just showed on how much he believed in this idea of the American Constitution, Declaration of Independence. But at this time, nobody knew about the Philippines in the United States. North American Review published an article in 1898, and you can see it on the right, okay, saying Philippines is the Cuba of the Far East, and mentioned for the first time that there was a revolt against the Spanish in the Philippines. Early in his presidency, McKinley was asked the location of the Philippine Islands, and he said, somewhere away around on the other side of the world. And he later admitted, when I received the cable from Admiral Dewey, Commodore at the time, telling of the taking of the Philippines, I looked up their location on the globe. I could not have told where those darned islands were within 2,000 miles. Remember, okay, Theodore Roosevelt was the one who advocated for George Dewey become commander of the Asiatic Squadron, and he arranged for him to be selected over a more senior officer. So Dewey, okay, began, after that appointment, Dewey began making preparations for a potential war with Spain, which broke out in April 1898. And immediately after the beginning of the war, Dewey led an attack on Manila Bay, sinking or capturing the entire Spanish Pacific fleet while suffering only minor casualties. After the battle, okay, his fleet assisted in the capture of Manila. And Dewey's victory at Manila Bay was widely lauded in the United States, and he was promoted to Admiral of the Navy in 1903. Roosevelt said, didn't Admiral Dewey do wonderfully well? I got him the position out there in Asia last year, and I had to beg hard to do it. And the reason I gave was that we might have to send him to Manila. And we sent him, and he went. So, okay, while Assistant Secretary of the Navy, okay, Roosevelt was preparing for war in Washington, Admiral George Dewey in Hong Kong made plans to seize Manila, which was what he probably discussed with Roosevelt. The United States could defeat Spanish naval power, but that was not the same as controlling the Philippines, the land mass. Conquering territory required land troops. The U.S. Army was on the other side of the world. So what to do? Aguinaldo's soldiers had proven themselves against Spanish forces. Dewey imagined he could use them as a temporary rent an army, and he solicited Aguinaldo's assistance several times. Within a month of the main explosion in Cuba, Dewey dispatched Commander Edward Wood, remember Edward Wood? Okay, to liaise with Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo, sorry, I have to have a sip of water. Hold on a second. Aguinaldo naturally assumed that he was dealing with an emissary of the top US official in Asia. He was hearing the official American position on this revolution. Commander Edward Wood told Aguinaldo that the United States would support Filipino independence if the Filipino army teamed with the US Navy against Spain. Aguinaldo asked whether the United States had design of its own for the Philippines. Wood assured him, the United States is a great and rich nation and needs no colonies. When Aguinaldo suggested that he commit this in writing, Wood replied that he would refer the matter to Admiral Dewey. In almost every meeting, Aguinaldo asked for a signed agreement stating their intention and obligations. The U.S. consul to Singapore, Spencer Pratt, assured him, the government of North America is a very honest, just, and powerful government. There is no necessity for entering into a formal written agreement because the word of the Admiral and of the United States Consul were in fact equivalent to the most solemn pledge that their verbal promises and assurances would be fulfilled to the letter and were not to be classed with Spanish promises or Spanish ideas of a man's word of honor. So, okay. So there's actually controversy over this whole dialogue between Aguinaldo and Dewey and Pratt. Okay, they're saying that some of the historians saying, well, maybe there was a lack of yes, there's a lack of written agreements. There's ambiguity of verbal interchanges. There's potential misunderstanding between the English-speaking Americans and the Spanish-speaking Filipinos. Okay, but it's very clear that the American emissaries gave Aguinaldo every encouragement possible to go along with this. So on May 1st, 1898, the Battle of Manila Bay took place. And it happened between Admiral Patricio Montoyo from Spain versus Commodore George Dewey from the United States. Admiral Dewey had modern steel ships versus Spain's creaky wooden ships. And they were very conveniently tied up in a row in Manila Bay Harbor. Okay. And so Dewey had to just drive by and shoot all these tied up ships, okay, sink them to the ground. Then when he came to the end of the harbor, he turned around and used his cannons on the other side of his ships to do a second round. The battle was so one-sided that Dewey had his soldiers break for a sit-down morning meal. After the dishes were washed and dried, the US Navy resumed its attack, or so the story goes. There's also a story about saying that they had to break for breakfast because they ran out of ammunitions, and they had for more ammunitions to be delivered. So many in the US assumed that Dewey's victory assured control of the Philippines, but the US Navy held only Manila Bay. The American consulate operated from a ship. The Spanish colonial forces held the walled city of Manila and its immediate environment, and the Philippines Revolutionary Army had the rest of the country. So because of Dewey's victory, okay, of the Turkey shoot, there was an explosion of pro-Dewey articles in the American press, and you can any oh my goodness, souvenirs, okay, that you can think of were produced with Dewey's image on it, from coffee mugs to plates to vases to kitchen towels to soap boxes, as you can see here on the right, okay. Just massive, massive glorification of Dewey. Apparently, his name became the most the baby boys in the United States that year were mostly named after him. So lots and lots of propaganda. Some of the propaganda is here. Okay. Americans saw the white-haired Navy military man as the paragon of American racial superiority, civilization, and manhood. Biographers traced Dewey's heritage through Saxon royal lines as far back as the early century AD. And this next quote is from Winston Churchill. Admiral Dewey was the logical result of a system which produces the best naval officers in the world. The American officer combines valuable qualities of his own with the necessary traits which are found in the English and other northern races, i.e. Anglo-Saxon/Teutonic races. And Roosevelt said, no man since the Civil War, whether a soldier or civilian, has added so much to the honorable renown of the nation or has deserved so well of it. So the Navy Department ordered Dewey to attack the Spanish naval power before he was able to secure his rent an army. Okay, and they brought Amelia Aguinaldo from Hong Kong to the U.S. McCulloch, and in May of 1898. That afternoon, or a few days later, Aguinaldo was meeting with Dewey. Aguinaldo grilled Dewey about the United States' past verbal assurances and asked for written commitment to Filipino independence. And Aguinaldo reported in his book, True Version of the Philippine Revolution, as Dewey saying, the United States would unquestionably recognize the independence of the people of the Philippines, guaranteed as it was by the word of honor of Americans, which, he said, is more positive, more irrevocable than any written agreement. So Aguinaldo reluctantly went to see his comrade in arms. So this is where I got this information from this book. So it was meeting with the Filipino junta, and the issue to the resolve, okay, Aguinaldo insisted that it would be reckless to go to the Philippines in the absence of a written agreement with Admiral Dewey. But one of the junta members recommended that Aguinaldo should go home because of the advantages which would come to the Philippines if the president, Aguinaldo, should go there in the present critical circumstances, and the great injury which was sure to be done if this departure was postponed any longer. It was also the consensus that if Washington was true to the fundamental principles of its constitution, there was no doubt that it would not attempt to colonize the Philippines or even to annex them. In any case, the president, Aguinaldo, with his prestige in the Philippines, would be able to arouse those masses to combat the demands of the United States if they colonized that country, and would drive them, if circumstances rendered it necessary, to a titanic struggle for their independence, even if they should succumb in shaking off the yoke of a new oppressor. So they were quite aware that it was possible that the United States would take over the Philippines. So thus the proposal to send Aguinaldo home to renew the revolution was approved by the junta, which paved the way for the return of Aguinaldo to the Philippines. Aguinaldo immediately set himself to organize an army. In less than a month, he liberated the province of Cavite, defeated the Spaniards, declared independence, laid siege on the city awaiting its surrender, and established a republican government in September of 1898. In June, there was an issue of the Singapore Free Press, which mentioned that Consul Pratt of Singapore, U.S. Consul Pratt of Singapore, received a letter from Aguinaldo dated June 11th. The letter gave an update on the progress of the campaign, the victory of the insurgents in Cavite. It also mentioned that the Filipino forces were less than a mile from the old walled city of Manila, and that the Spanish forces were now surrounded. The letter was sealed with General Aguinaldo's official seal, a representation of the rising sun, surrounded by the phrase Gobierno Dictatorial Filipinas. Consul Pratt did not reply to Aguinaldo's letter. Perhaps he did not want to have anything further to do with him, because on or about June 16, 1898, he received an admonishment from Washington that he should not attempt to commit the U.S. government in its dealings with Aguinaldo. The cable reads, "It is assumed that you did not attempt to commit this government to any alliance with the Philippine insurgents. To obtain the unconditional personal assistance of General Aguinaldo in the expedition to Manila was proper if, in so doing, he was not induced to form hopes which it might not be practicable to gratify. If in the course of your conferences with Aguinaldo you acted upon the assumption that this government would cooperate with him for the furtherances of any plan of his own, or that in accepting his cooperation it would consider itself pledged to recognize political claims which he may put forward, your action was unauthorized and cannot be approved." Okay, so this came out, okay, into this controversial agreement between Consul Pratt and Aguinaldo broke into international limelight. It created a gigantic scandal, okay, because of the publication of this book in 1899. Consul Pratt consequently was, I think he either retired or he was sent packing, okay? So Howard W. Bray, he was a long-term resident in the Philippines. He said, okay, "I have known the Philippines intimately for 17 years, probably better than or more thoroughly than most people. And I must confess I was surprised at his unstinted and unselfish devotion, which I submit is indeed a charming trait in the character of these much maligned people, against whom the free people of the United States are committing one of the greatest crimes in history, in the name of what McKinley, with methodistical cant and revolting hypocrisy, terms benevolent assimilation." And the American consul in Hong Kong, Mr. Roosevelt Wildman, who was also relieved of his post because of the scandal, said, "I wish to put myself on record as stating that the insurgent government of the Philippines cannot be dealt with as though they were North American Indians, willing to be removed from one reservation to another at the whim of their master. If the United States decide not to retain the Philippine Islands, its 10 million people will demand independence, and the attempt of any foreign nation to obtain territory or coaling stations will be resisted with the same spirit which they fought the Spaniards." So the Filipinos were taking significant steps to establish their government. The administration of President McKinley and its representatives on the island were silent about American intentions. Aguinaldo was never told that he was only supposed to defeat the Spaniards and that his duty was to hand over the country to the Americans. He continued to entertain the idea that the Americans were standing by their commitment in Singapore, and that they would recognize the independence of the Philippines. So he went ahead, and on June 12th, 1898, okay, they celebrated their first Independence Day. He unfurled the country's new flag, explaining that the banner's red, white, and blue colors were a salute to the flag of the United States of America as a manifestation of our profound gratitude towards that great nation for the disinterested protection she is extending to us and will continue to extend to us. Little did he know that the Filipinos would not celebrate another Independence Day for 64 years. In the meantime, you had these absolutely disgusting depictions of Filipinos in the United States. Puck magazine here on the left, you can see this is definitely the face of Aguinaldo. Okay, this is Judge magazine, McKinley giving the Filipinos their first bath. Okay, and then here on the right hand side, okay, a cartoon. Okay, on top you see before the United States intervened in behalf of these oppressed peoples, you had the Philippines oppressed by the Spanish, industrial slavery in Hawaii, Puerto Rico and Cuba being under the Spanish yoke, the Isthmus of Panama at the end. Okay, and now after the United States had rescued them from their oppressions, you see stand-up men in top hats and well dressed. That's the influence of American civilization. So one crucial element became clear: the Spanish were white and the Filipinos were not. The Americans, so think about this is the situation. You have this Filipino revolutionary forces having control over the majority of the Philippine Islands. The Spanish are holding Manila, okay, the city of Manila and surrounding areas, and the US is holding the Bay of Manila, okay? So the Americans went to the Spanish with a deal. The US forces would pretend to attack Manila. The Spanish would pretend to defend. And after a little noise, the Spanish would surrender the capital to the Americans. The Americans would then claim a glorious victory. The Spanish, who had realized they could not win, a manly defeat without casualties. Admiral Dewey recalled, "The Governor General arranged with me that I was to go up and fire a few shots. Then I was to make the signal, 'Do you surrender?' And he would hoist the white flag, and then the troops would march in." All of this was kept secret from the Filipinos. Okay, so August 13th, 1898, the sham Battle of Manila took place. Filipino troops tried to join their US Army allies, but the Americans shot at them to prevent any but white troops from passing through Manila's thick walls. And historian Ambeth Ocampo writes, "By nightfall, it had become painfully clear that the Americans transformed the ally to enemy." And here you see a picture of the US Army soldier on Manila's wall, and there were no Filipinos up there. So on August 13th, 1898, the city of Manila was captured by American expeditionary forces. The terms of the Spanish capitulations were signed on the next day. And from this day, American government in the Philippines begins. And there was a United States military government. And the first military governor of the Philippines was General Wesley Merritt, who, in accordance with the instructions of the United States President, issued a proclamation announcing the establishment of United States military rule. So in his 1898 notes for the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on December 10th, 1898, which ended the Spanish-American War with Spain surrendering Cuba and ceding territories including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, McKinley made a statement of America's responsibilities. He said, "We took up arms only in obedience to the dictates of humanity and in the fulfillment of high public and moral obligations. We had no design of aggrandizement and no ambition of conquest." Regarding the Philippines in particular, he continues, "Without any desire or design on our part, the war has brought us new duties and responsibilities which we must meet and discharge as becomes a great nation on whose growth and career from the beginning the ruler of nations has plainly written the high command and pledge of civilization." And he mentions the benefits of trade. Incidentally to our tenure in the Philippines is the commercial opportunity to which American statesmanship cannot be indifferent. It is just to use every legitimate means for the enlargement of American trade, but we seek no advantages in the Orient which are not common to all. Asking only the open door for ourselves, we are ready to accord the open door to others. So on February 4th, 1899, just 2 days before the United States Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris, narrowly, fighting broke out between American forces and Filipino nationalists led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who sought independence rather than a change in colonial rulers. There were two phases of the Philippine-American War. The first phase was a conventional war, which didn't go so well for the Filipinos. And the second phase was marked by the shift to guerrilla-style warfare. And that began in November of 99 and lasted through the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901 and into the spring of 1902. And by that time, most organized Filipino resistance had dissipated. The Philippine-American War lasted 3 years and resulted in the death of over 4,200 American and over 20,000 Filipino combatants. As many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. So, with the death of President McKinley, who was shot, President Teddy Roosevelt became president, and there was a change in the Monroe Doctrine. Oh, sorry. So whereas previously, the doctrine was clear, it said the occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers, that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. So this was the original Monroe Doctrine, And then since Teddy Roosevelt came in, he announced the Roosevelt Corollary in his annual messages to Congress in 1904 and 1905. And he says, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may in America as elsewhere ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Teddy Roosevelt said, our future history will be more determined by our position on the Pacific facing China than by our position on the Atlantic facing Europe. I wish to see the United States the dominant power on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. And his motto was, speak softly and carry a big stick, which led to World War II in the Pacific, the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Korean War, okay, among other things. So by July 4th, 1902, okay, the Philippine-American War pretty much was over. President Roosevelt proclaimed a general amnesty and declared the conflict over, although there still were minor uprisings and insurrections against American rule, okay, over the years, okay. And the United States would not grant independence to the Philippines until 1946, okay, because remember, they were not ready to run a government, okay. So these are a few cartoons, commentaries. So you had opposition to U.S. imperialism, okay? This is a magazine called Life, called The March of the Strenuous Civilization, and is subversive because it picks up on a famous pro-imperialist speech by Theodore Roosevelt entitled The Strenuous Life, okay? This is what he said in his speech, what Theodore Roosevelt said in his speech. I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life, the life of toil and effort, of labor and strife, to preach that highest form of success which comes not to the man who desires mere easy peace, but to the man who does not shrink from danger. So, if we do our duty aright in the Philippines, we will add to that national renown, which is the highest and finest part of national life, will greatly benefit the people of the Philippines Islands, and above all, we will play our part well in the great work of uplifting mankind. Now, have a look at the cartoon, okay? And you will see, okay, so you have the missionary leading the charge, holding a missionary ledger. Immediately behind him is a sword brandishing sailor carrying loot, and a rifle bearing soldier carrying booty. Science comes next, clutching lyddite, which is a high explosive first used by the British in the Boer War. Literature follows, holding the text of Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Music plays an organ labeled Two-Step Symphony, $mark forever. Behind music comes sculpture holding up a monument to a war hero. Painting carried a portfolio inscribed Light, deaf to all schools but ours. And the last marcher holds up a drummer's sample, okay, referring to traveling salesmen of business and commerce. And you see skulls, okay, dot the landscape, okay, and vultures hover over the procession, and the artifacts of past civilization are trampled underfoot at the rear. So this is progress under strenuous civilization. Here is another one, okay, from Life, again from this Life magazine, okay, and it says, "Lucky Filipinos. It appears that the Filipinos have lost confidence in Americans. Do those benighted wretches fail to realize that we have accomplished what we have accomplished in their islands? We may have burned certain villages, destroyed considerable property, and incidentally slaughtered a few thousand of their sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, etc. But what did they expect? Were we to transport an army more than halfway around the earth merely to listen to peace propositions? Not much. And look at Manila. 2 years ago, the main street of Manila did not possess a single saloon. Now there are 13 on this one street. And they complain that drunken American soldiers insult the native women. What do they expect from a drunken soldier anyway? Progress is now in those islands. She may be red-handed and at times drunk, but she is there for business." And you can see the skeleton up here as a cloud. So in the United States, there was a fight still against anti-imperialism. On June 15th, 1898, the American Anti-Imperialist League was founded. The problem was that a lot of the members of that group were quite elderly. George Boutwell, who was the president, was 80 years old. Senator Hoare, 72, Andrew Carnegie, 63, Mark Twain, 63, Labor leader Samuel Gompers, 48, former President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, 61 years old. Okay. They actually had set out to gather petitions. 5 million, they wanted to collect 5 million signatures on a petition. And the drive petered out after only a few thousand. On the other hand, you had the US pro-imperialist faction, and you can see they're all young men, okay? Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, 48, Theodore Roosevelt, 40, Endicott Peabody, 41, Rudyard Kipling, 33, Senator Albert Beveridge, 36, William Howard Taft, okay, 41. So it was turning out to be a battle between the old guard and the young bucks. And this is what US Secretary of War William Howard Taft had to say in 1905 about the Philippines. Okay. The problem in the Philippines is the problem of making the people whom we are to govern in those islands for their benefit believe that we are sincere when we tell them that we are there for their benefit, and make them patient while we are instructing them in self-government. You cannot make them patient unless you convince them of your good intentions. I am confronted with the repeated question, shall we grant them independence at once, or are we right to show them that they cannot be made fit for independence at once? They are not yet ready for independence, and if they talk of independence at the present time, it is mere wind. And this is another cartoon. I believe it's Puck magazine. Okay, so, okay, over here on the wall, on the white wall, back here, okay, it reads, the Confederate States refused their consent to be governed, but the Union was preserved without their consent. And the class, the girls here, are holding books, school books labeled Alaska, Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico. The blackboard here reads, okay, the consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The US must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. And you can see further, here is China on the threshold, not in the house, outside the house looking in. Here's the Native American holding his lecture, ABC, upside down, sitting in the corner. Looks like a, put in the corner there. And on the left here, of course, the American black Americans cleaning the windows. And here the newest students who have to learn how to participate in this, which is Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. So Theodore Roosevelt, okay, assumed the presidency on September 14th, 1901. He agreed with his Anglo-Saxon friends that the Filipinos were not capable of self-government. He also believed in the importance of the Philippine Islands as refueling stations for the Navy. Yet he sought an end to a war that was characterized by brutalities on both sides. So he proclaimed a general amnesty and ceasefire on July 4th, 1902. William Howard Taft served as the first Governor General of the Philippines with his wife Helen Taft, and they instituted reforms designed to instill democracy. In November of 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was established as a transitional government to prepare the country for independence from American control. But then, of course, World War II intervened, and the Philippines remained under US protection and oversight until 1946. Okay. In 1904, President Roosevelt issued the corollary, okay, which we already discussed. And this so-called Roosevelt corollary, a corollary is an extension of a previous idea, to the Monroe Doctrine contained a great irony. Okay, so the Monroe Doctrine had been sought to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, and now the Roosevelt corollary justified American intervention throughout the Western Hemisphere. And this was ended in 1934 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt renounced interventionism and established his good neighbor policy within the Western Hemisphere. So, okay, this is FDR's looking forward speech, where he said, in the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and because he does so, respects the rights of others, the neighbor who respects the sanctity of his agreements in and with a world of neighbors. And that's the end of my story.
That was amazing, Magdalena. What a powerhouse of a presentation. Wow. Thank you very much for going through that. And it was definitely worth the, I mean, it was real classes in session, right? Like this is a great Easter gift. Okay, so lot of questions. I have a question, but I'm gonna hold back. I know Peter Nikitas had a good one. So Peter, are you still there?
Here I am, Matthew. Here I am, Magdalena. I think I'm standing in the or I'm sitting. Okay, here's my question, Matt. Here's my question, Magdalena. What steps led to the discrediting of William Gilpin's intercontinental railway vision in the period from 1895 to 1902? And a follow-up, what influence transformed Alfred Thayer Mahan into the sea power influence imperialist that history knows him as?
Well, Mahan, okay, I can answer Mahan. The first question, I don't. Okay, anyway, Mahan. But first of all, it was Great Britain who was the biggest naval power in the world at the time, right? And if you have this Anglo-Saxon mentality that you want to expand and you want to expand westwards, you had to go and you had to do that by ship because, you know, the continent ends, right? And the water starts. So you have to do it by ship. And the United States Navy was definitely not up to par for this. It was old, creaky wooden ships. And Mahan also had read, okay, Theodore Roosevelt's book, the 1812, of the 1812 war, and where Roosevelt discussed what importance the Navy had in the war. Because remember, Roosevelt's uncles were both involved with the British Navy, and they were actually traitors, okay, against the United States. And they had been, one of his uncles, Jimmy Bullock, I believe it is, he is actually buried in England because he was considered a traitor to the United States. Okay, so Roosevelt himself was very convinced of the importance of a navy for expansionary means, and he had published his book before Mahan did. So there's a debate among historians about who influenced whom, but really I think it's both together, kind of, okay, push this idea of Navy expansionism. And the Intercontinental Railroad, okay, can't answer that. So maybe somebody else can.
I'll just say a word on that. I think probably the best resource for like your specific kind of question, like what stopped or sabotaged the organic spread of the William Gilpin idea of land power and win-win cooperation, shared by people around Sergei Witte in Russia and so many others in the Meiji Restoration government, is probably Anton Chaikin's, I think it was published first in the mid 80s, his Treason in America, mapping out sort of the roots of this agency. And, Magdalena also alluded to different figures who are part of the occult underground that gives the sort of the dark heart and soul of this fifth column operation in America through the figure of William James, who plays a big role in Anton Chaikin's research. And William James was also a teacher, a very influential teacher of Teddy Roosevelt, as Magdalena introduced in our last class. He was the president of the American Society for Psychical Research and also a teacher of John Dewey and the entire Fabian leadership that went and created this weird perversion of an education system inside of America before and after World War I. But William James plays a key role in the occult underground, which was behind this transformation of America, and also that had penetrations deep into Russia too through its own form, but was always coordinated. So Anton Chaikin's Treason in America is a vital reference for that stuff. I know that we'll go to Thomas. Thomas, are you still there? I noticed in the comment section you had a few thoughts, interesting thoughts, questions. If you'd like to throw one or two out, you're welcome to.
Just a straightforward question about. I heard somewhere, I think, whether it was from you or Gordon, based Patrick Henry or whatever he's called, somewhere around here that it was in 1911 that the Congress made a report or concluded that the USS Maine blew up from the inside, which makes it another false flag operation. And associated with that was when were those books published that you mentioned? My main interest is when was this information available? When some of us older people were still in high school? In the 70s and 80s?
Which books you mean now?
The ones you referred to at the beginning, that you based your presentation
Okay,
on.
so this one here, not that long ago. Okay.
Yeah.
When was this published? No, it was published 2009.
Okay.
2009. Okay.
Yeah.
But again, yes, people say about the Maine, they use the Maine as a casus belli for war, right? And there is a report from the captain of the Maine where he voiced his belief that it might have been an accident.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and okay, and he actually, James Bradley in here quotes it. I just have to find it where that came out. But anyway, it doesn't really matter if it was an accident or if it was really blown up. I mean, that's what caused the uproar in the United States, and then caused the war declaration to come about.
Peter Nikitas made the point that Admiral Rickover also concluded the same thing for the Maine. Are you saying, Peter, that he concluded that it was an internal explosion or that it was a false flag or what?
He concluded it was an internal explosion as far as ruling out external sabotage. And I don't know whether he took a couple or three more additional steps to assert a false flag conclusion on this.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Hey, Magdalena, in your research, did at all the empire of the Golden Circle, with its intention to develop a slave empire, and I know you alluded to some of this stuff in your first class a little bit, but did this? And I was thinking as you're going through Cuba, you have the figure of the mercenary William Walker, who made himself sort of a dictator of, I forget if it was Nicaragua or Venezuela. I think it was Nicaragua for a period. But
I
did
think it was
this?
Nicaragua. Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, did the work that you did on this current story, did it tie in, or did you have direct players that were formerly part of the Golden Circle paramilitary group play a role in the current configuration, or the KKK followers of Albert Pike and that network that was also growing in the wake of the Civil War? Did they play into this
I'm
directly?
absolutely certain they did. I couldn't name you any names right now, but there's definitely, because there was a there was a fight in the United States, right? And
Mm,
it was the Southern grouping that was advocating, okay, taking it all.
right. Yeah.
So, and especially with the sugar interest, right, in America,
Hmm.
which coincides with the Golden Night of the Golden Circle idea.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, all right. Well, if there's any other questions or thoughts that people would like to toss out at Magdalena, now would be the time to do it. We got a little bit of time left on our schedule.
I just wanted to note the obvious that the principles of American imperialism were set down. We still have the right to protect idea, and that we're spreading democracy. It hasn't changed. It's all obvious, but I just
Yeah,
wanted to mention that.
it's what I'm thinking is, I'm thinking, yes, so you had the Monroe Doctrine completely perverted with the Teddy Roosevelt corollary, but it wasn't happening just with Teddy. It happened because of the change in philosophy or ideology within the United States, okay, coming all the way from the Civil War through to the 1900s. 20th hundreds, yeah, 20th century. And because so there was a perversion about this, and it was very much propagated by Teddy Roosevelt. And then later, as we always say, I ended with Franklin Delano Roosevelt for a reason, because he pushed the good neighbor policy, and he reversed some of this stuff. Okay, but then again, okay, you saw who gives what's his name, Teddy Roosevelt, this posthumous medal, which is Clinton, right? So why would you do that? I mean, think about this. Think about this. Clinton is going to be out of office in a couple of days, and this is one of his last acts in the White House, and he's giving a damn medal, sorry, okay, to Teddy Roosevelt. Why? He obviously, this is like a signal for me. I thought that this is a signal that he is being completely taken over by that crowd.
Yeah. Well,
There's
I
no
think
other.
that the irony there, and almost like a paper could be written about that, because it's such a sharp irony,
Yeah.
is his Rhodes Scholarship, right? The fact that Clinton ushered in the Rhodes Scholarship takeover. It wasn't just him. There was like 28 other Rhodes Scholars that came in with him
Yeah.
in 92. And it was Cecil Rhodes's sort of philosophy that was the guiding spirit of this perverse manifest destiny that Teddy and also people like Rudyard Kipling, who was a follower of Cecil Rhodes and others, was really embodying. So I think, yeah, that 1998 enshrining of him as sort of a legendary hero beyond reproach by Clinton, of all people, is
Yeah.
super interesting. Really something.
Well, they always say, right? You use what is it? You use to corrupt somebody, or to get somebody, to get to somebody's core, is you use sex, money, and what? What's the other one? Okay, there's three usually. And with Clinton, they use
Power.
sex. Yeah, and with Clinton, they use sex, right? With Monica Lewinsky, and they had him by literally the balls, okay? And then he does this, and I'm going like, okay, he completely sold out. And that was a signal. I mean, he sold out.
Jerry says that this was, and Jerry made a great point. This is right before 9/11. This was being set up for, so obviously the U.S. character was supposed to be changed with the advent of the planned, the new Maine 2.0, I guess you can think of it
Yeah.
that way, 9/11.
Yeah.
Right. And Jerry, you're saying 2001 was the official award of the medal, or what? You brought up 2001. Sure. What does that 2001 mean?
In January of 2001, just before, a few days before Bush is inaugurated.
Yeah.
I had forgotten about it because everyone was all upset because Clinton's last day, he issued pardons to about 250 people and some real horrible people. But just a few days before that is when he posthumously gave this Medal of Honor to Teddy Roosevelt. And I think it just slipped by everybody.
Yeah.
But when you look at it now, January 2001, shortly later, we have 9/11, and the response of the government was the Teddy Roosevelt response with the big stick. It's really eerie, this thing. When Madeline mentioned that Clinton awarded in 2000, I just couldn't get over it. There's something there. And for anyone who still had lingering likes for Clinton, I hope this blows that out of the water. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
No,
So
that's good. Yeah.
in James Bradley's book, it says, okay, it's just a couple of sentences here. It says, Captain Charles Dwight Sixby, the main's skipper, suspected that the explosion had been caused by a fire in a coal bunker next to a reserve magazine, which was a frequent mishap aboard steam-driven warships. I mean, think about it. Yes, it's this coal, right? They're using coal, okay? And they put the magazines, the armament stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So it was a frequent mishap.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what James Bradley had to say in the book about the Maine.
Mac has a question. Mac, you there? Mac Walker. All right, I'll just read it.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm
There
here.
you are. Yeah, go for it.
Well,
Hi, Mac.
hi. Thanks for your talk. That was learned a lot. There's current suggestions about USA annexing Canada or just the province of Alberta. How does that thought of annexation presently conform to these older imperialistic policies of America? Thanks.
Okay. My husband probably has a little bit more to say about that. I can't really comment. Well, no, not saying that. Anyway, Jerry, can you answer this? Putting you on the spot.
Well, no, it was that cartoon you had that was making fun of, wow, with or without people's consent, we have to, civilize them. I think the whole question of Canada is a question of, it's in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The consent of the governed is really the issue involved. It's, the annexation would obviously be Teddy Roosevelt's policy. If Canada voted, or if Alberta voted to join, that's consent of the government. That's a different story. It's same as if Quebec voted to separate. That's the consent of the government. Yeah, you have to respect that. And I mean, the problem is there is no government in Canada at this point. Mark Carney has already issued his declaration of sovereignty to King Charles and his descendants forever. So that's the problem. Canada should actually just declare independence from Britain, and that would solve the problem.
Well, what if Alberta voted to separate in its own referendum? Would the USA see the United Nations prohibition on invasion be engaged? Would Trump be legally entitled to move in if Albertans voted to separate in their own referendum?
I don't think so. The precedent was Louis Riel who went to the United States and met with President Ulysses S. Grant and asked him if the U.S. would militarily intervene, and Grant said, no, we can't. Legally, we can't. So I think that precedent has been set.
Then there's Putin in Ukraine.
Yeah, but Ukraine doesn't have the Constitution of the United States.
It's definitely it's one of those things where I think you always have to have a firm foundation, natural law. Like if there was an actual plebiscite, like a real democratic referendum, it would be. I mean, Canada doesn't really have a military to threaten. Like there's no Ottawa military that's similar to the neo-Nazi run Kievan regime that could like deploy a genocide regime on the Albertans, or let's say that we're done at some point and go back. It's not really there. There's not really a military as such. So I don't think that there would be an obligation or any reason for the U.S. to go in and protect Albertan separatists. You know, it's a totally different situation from anything we see in the context of the NATO expansion on around Russia, utilizing neo-Nazi, disposable fanatics.
I wonder if the United States would have to have a vote on accepting Alberta into the United States.
Probably, I guess. I don't know. It's a conversation to have.
It goes
sure.
It goes both ways, right? I mean,
Yeah.
really. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, Mac. Is that somewhat satisfying in some way?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Sure. All right. I didn't know about the Riel connection to Ulysses S. Grant. I didn't know that he went down there to ask for support. That's new to me. That's it. Have you written anything about that, Jared?
No, I haven't got that far. I'm still at 1812. I'm about 70 years away.
All right. Marty has been commenting in the. Oh, Pete says it's in Riel's memoirs. I actually have those. I should really just open them up at some point. Okay. Thank you, Pete. All right, Marty. I saw you've been sharing some thoughts in the chat. Obviously, you're going to be giving the lecture next week, so I'm going to throw it at you. What are your thoughts based on what you just heard from Magdalena today and 2 weeks ago?
Magdalena, bless you as always. She makes everybody else look good. She informs us all. It was a wonderful presentation, and you made it easy for me next week because I've got nothing to add to what you say. But I'll be taking. That's the point. I'll be taking the story to the next stage. What happened next? And I really should, I suppose, say something about the Rhodes Scholars because I'm an Oxford man, and I was not a Rhodes Scholar, but I knew enough of them in my time. And I wasn't there in Bill Clinton's time. I was there just a few years after him. And the first point to make is Rhodes Scholars are presented, especially in that wonderful idiot show for 3-year-olds, The West Wing. And if anybody has not seen an episode of The West Wing, you have to watch it because it's a repulsive infantile fairy tale. And everything is the opposite of what appears there. I dealt with White House staffs for major newspapers and news agencies, at times even as their White House, and certainly for many years as their State Department correspondent. And the image you see in the White House, in the West Wing, which British television critics have seriously and solemnly called comparable with Shakespeare and the greatest television drama in human history. I mean, look into it, Magdalena. You'll have endless entertainment on this. It's unbelievable. They revere it so much, and it's infantile. Excuse the language, ladies. Shit, it's ludicrous. The people who are White House correspondents, Trump's too, and his is not the worst. The absolute illiterate lady who's as tongue-tied as Kamala Harris, who was Biden's press secretary, is typical of them. They are sheep caught in the headlights. They are terrified of everyone. They are illiterate idiots. White House staffers are egotistical little jerks who know nothing about anything and whose ignorance is proverbial. Their idea of research and expertise is to click on Google 2 or 3 times, and if they don't get what they want, they assume it cannot be there. And this is the level of quote-unquote serious intellectual research in Washington, D.C. for at least the past 40 years, and actually older. Because as Henry Kissinger, of all people, pointed out, all you had to do was open up any edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica printed in Chicago since at least 1911, to know that, and look up the articles on Vietnam relations with China, to know that the Vietnamese have always hated and feared the Chinese more than anyone else. Therefore, the idea that they were going to conquer all of Asia on behalf of China, as Dean Rusk and McNamara and LBJ and Westmoreland and all those abominable idiots of the time of the Vietnam War all devoutly believed, is infantile nonsense. And they could have found this out in 5 minutes by getting one of their staffers, since none of them could obviously read themselves, to look it up in the Britannica. And this is the level of research in Washington. Now, the British Empire lasted as long as it did because they had a small cadre of genuine experts and people who had spent lifetimes in the countries they were enslaving and manipulating, who at least knew, at least at a superficial and technical level, what was going on there and knew something of the history. In America, with vastly more resources, we have none of that at all. And actually, you see this all the way back with, I mean, what you pointed it out, Magdalena, you documented it. You have a handful of power-crazed idiots and fantasists who live in a dream world. And they pass themselves off as experts. And the rest of the dumb American public and media accept them at their own estimation and face value. And they know nothing about what they're dealing with. So we have our gallant little allies from Chiang Kai-shek, who killed 10 million people himself, and if Mao hadn't been there, would go down as the greatest domestic killer in all the enormously long history of China. And we allow him to interweave effortlessly with American drug opium interests. We re-empower the mafia and its prostitution and heroin rings because we imagine we need them to win World War II in Sicily, which was another ludicrous fantasy to start with. We do all these things, and we're totally ignorant of the psychopaths we're unleashing and of the circumstances we're dealing with. And instead, you have fairy tales like The West Wing, that all our leaders are thoughtful and visionary. And one ironical thing here is, who was the first American president to win a Nobel Peace Prize? This overlaps with what you've been saying, Magdalena.
Yeah.
You know it, of course. Do you want to
Yes.
say it?
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Teddy Roosevelt.
Exactly. And what was the greatest triumph, diplomatic triumph, of Republican secretaries of state up to World War II? I mean, you can give many answers to this question, but the one for which as Secretary of State Frank Kellogg was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1928, the legal outlawing of all war in the world in 1928. How did that work out? Here again, today I covered Secretary of State Jim Baker, and he was a tough, ruthless guy. I was going to say he would have made a marvelous consigliere for any mafia chief, but of course that's what he was. He was the consigliere to George Bush, who ran the secret state personally with great ruthlessness and efficiency for 17 years. And I liked and respected Baker, and my career flourished when I covered him because he gave me access as well. I wasn't personally close to him. I wouldn't have presumed it. But he was a serious and dignified man. He was not a man to cross lightly, nor was his master, the first President Bush. The second President Bush, I met both of them on many occasions. The second President Bush, of course, was what he appeared to be, a drunken, incoherent idiot, a total fool. The father was very different. The father appeared to be, this slightly effete, genteel, upper-class fellow who goes from, I always forget which public school it was, Andover was it, or whichever, I stand to be corrected, but to Yale, and not tough enough for this hard, cruel world. But he was tough enough, all right. It was a veneer. Beneath the veneer, and when he had a drink or two, and I saw him when he had a beer or two in him, his whole body language changed. His demeanor changed. He became a tough, leering, sleazy, brilliant, efficient
tough as nails, hard cursing Texas oil man. One shoulder would go up, the other shoulder would go down. He'd start smiling like this, and if you're a lady in his presence, you'd better have the taste for his interests, because they would be there. But it was a different man. It was the real man. But he was a very intelligent, ruthless, forceful, able man. And not only the public, but the media never saw any of this, or were too stupid to see what was going on in front of their eyes. So I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit here, a tangent, but we see that you pointed this out with TR. As the great Gore Vidal has this wonderful essay basically called Teddy Roosevelt Was a Sissy. Vidal, who was certainly not a sissy, he was simultaneously gay and handsome and tough and patriotic and brave, and served with distinction in the U.S. Marines and in the U.S. Coast Guard when his health didn't allow him to serve in the Marines through World War II, later in World War II. And he wasn't a sissy, far from it, but he had an eye for the phony. And he also, of course, had this wonderful, glorious wit. He was too good a writer to ever, and too politically incorrect to ever have a chance of winning a Nobel Prize. And of course, they never gave him a Pulitzer. They wouldn't dare, because he told the truth about America. But when you read Vidal, you read the unvarnished truth about America. And also, you better read Vidal privately at home, because if you read him in public, you'll embarrass yourself. He's such a wonderfully funny and witty writer that you laugh loudly and uncontrollably on every page. He is that good. But the media miss this. If I may, just one more story on the tangent and switch it back. Eisenhower was universally regarded as a kind, lovable, but unsophisticated idiot and a dolt when he was president. And he deliberately created this image, because when he speaks in public, most of the time as president, he's talking gobbledygook. It doesn't make sense. So you assume you're dealing with a fool. But once his private papers and records were released, a totally, again, like George Herbert Walker Bush, a totally different kind of human being emerges. Forceful, cynical, dynamic, ruthless, making poor judgments, but also always ready to cover up his judgments and feed everybody to the wolves. John Kennedy said about Eisenhower, who he got to know very well during the transition to the presidency and afterwards. He said, my God, Kennedy said of Eisenhower, he is the coldest son of a bitch I have ever met in my life. He takes people and drops them at every stage. He dropped his boyhood friends, then he dropped his West Point friends, then he dropped his senior army friends, and he moved up into the higher business classes. He used people and he dropped them. And when Eisenhower died, his wife was asked during the funeral, and they assumed she would be brokenhearted. Well, she appears to be brokenhearted by having to be married to him all those years. It was not easy. And she is asked by her own son, what was he really like? His only surviving son did not know what his father was like. And after 50 years of marriage, Mamie Eisenhower says, I don't know what he was like. I never knew him. I don't think anyone ever knew him. Oh. But the one thing to add to that is, I said, all the media, which is how much you can trust the American press corps, how brilliant, and dedicated and insightful they are, like in the West Wing, right? Always asking the thoughtful questions, citing Sartre or Voltaire or even Sesame Street, right? They're geniuses, right? But they fall for everything. So they all thought Eisenhower was a dolt and an idiot. But there was one man who saw through it, Mary Kempton, who was a liberal columnist for the New York Post, which in those days was the most liberal newspaper in America. Rupert Murdoch hadn't got his hands on it yet. And Kempton was very proud of his ability as one of the finest bridge players in higher society in Manhattan. He had a first-class intellect and a first-class mind for playing bridge, right? And he was rightly proud of his ability in bridge. I was always, my favorite game was always German whist, and I was passable, never particularly good at poker. But the complexities of bridge were always beyond me. I mean, you didn't learn bridge on the streets of Belfast, where my friends and I grew up. You just didn't. And you have to learn these things early on. Right? Chess I could do, but chess is very overrated. Charlie Krauthammer was proud of being a chess player, and so was the ghastly Brzezinski, which is why they screwed up everything they touched so much. Chess is very overrated. But bridge is very sophisticated. And Kempton discovers, to his astonishment, around 1955, that Eisenhower is a world-class bridge player. Between the two world wars, when he's only a major in the army and the pay was miserable, he nevertheless made a comfortable living by making up a fourth playing bridge with senior officers, colonels and generals high above his rank, and he never made enough money to make enemies. He was too shrewd for that, but he made enough money to allow himself and his wife and son to be raised in much more comfort, live in much more comfort than they otherwise would, consistently. And Murray Kempton's reaction to this is, my God, we've gotten Eisenhower all wrong. I thought Eisenhower was a good man, but just totally stupid. Now I realize it's the opposite. He's a brilliant man and totally evil. And I maintain that maybe a future reference lecture, Eisenhower needs to be reinterpreted. But the bottom line here is, and it fits in with what you were saying about TR, and the myths what did you just document, Magdalena? That a tiny little jerk like TR, who has documented before, has a fictional record as a frontiersman and a macho guy, and is the only guy allowed to have a horse in all the mud and mess of Cuba, when he's sending all these other people up to die on his glorious behalf ahead of him. He's the macho man. And he sneers at William McKinley, an incredibly brave teenage soldier through the worst battles of the Civil War, beyond anything Teddy Roosevelt had ever been in. And he sneers at the manhood of President McKinley and calls President McKinley a humane and principled, consistent man who is in fact martyred for his political beliefs, because he will not go along with the seizing of Hawaii or any war of extermination against the Filipino people. And TR calls President McKinley a chocolate eclair. And as I saw with Churchill, a lie in the hands of an impressive, evil little bastard will trump 100 books of documentation with the truth. People will prefer one ludicrous line with no documentation. McKinley has the backbone of a chocolate eclair. What a brilliant wit, what a genius to say this, against the well-documented evidence that Teddy Roosevelt was a contemptible, cowardly little shit.
Yeah.
And the evidence is there.
Yeah.
But nobody wants to look at the evidence. But I'm sorry, Matt, you knew you were unleashing this. I'm firing fireworks in every direction. Magdalena, thank you. That was just wonderful.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. I really appreciate that, Martin.
No,
Yeah,
And also the other thing is
organized chaos, Marty. I love it.
Disorganized chaos, Matt. At least on this occasion.
I want to add, also, of course, you had the role of William Randall Hearst at the time.
Yes.
Right? Who created that whole new category, okay, of so-called journalism, which we're now calling yellow journalism, right? Which was at that time, Teddy put it to use. I'm absolutely certain, because Teddy he knew how to manipulate the media. He really knew how to use it.
Even Edmund Morris, who worships the Teddy shrine, but he writes books for children, but there's revealing documentation in them. And first he calls Teddy Roosevelt 19th century America's greatest master of media and media relations, and he is. And he also points out that in 1898, Teddy Roosevelt brings along with him to Cuba a new movie camera, to take moving
Oh,
picture. It's the first time in history any war has been covered by the moving pictures. The technology is less than 5 years old in the public domain, and TR is already using it.
I forgot about that. Yes, absolutely. That's correct. Yes. Yep. Yep.
Magdalena, we're reaching the 5 o'clock mark here in Eastern Standard Time, so we have to kind of round it out. And I just really I want to express my gratitude so much for what you've just done, put forth as a real hardcore reference. I'm sure. Oh wait, one. Uwe says.
It's okay.
Oh, I was just saying goodbye. Brilliant lecture. Yes. Yes. So next week, the story will continue in a linear and non-linear way, but it's going to be something which I think we just got a taste of the what we could expect from Marty Seath. 2 p.m. next Sunday. Do you have a specific class, or do you want to keep it tentative and flexible, Marty?
Oh, very specific class, because it's a perfect sequel to Magdalena. I don't think I can do you justice, because you're much more thorough and structured, and the documentation is just wonderful that you put out. I mean, I know you and Jerry and other people here are so productive, but you really have to put this into books or formalize just what you've already given, because you've done the research, you've given the presentation. It's all there. What I'll be doing is the same story. How America for the past 120 years followed on the path that you pointed out. And I'll be quoting James Bradley just as you have. And again, the Taft revealing voyage with Alice Roosevelt.
Yeah, that's important. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because my theme is going to be 125 years of American imperialism in Asia. And the punchline is this. The American people and the American economy got nothing from it. They got 300,000 dead soldiers needlessly. They got the destruction of their domestic economy to satisfy the rising economies of Japan and South Korea, which would have risen under their own admirable efforts and sensible policies anyway. But the Americans gutted their own mercantile protection. They abandoned economic nationalism. And what did they do it for? Because Asia is the world of the future. Now, Asia is the world of the future, but that has nothing to do with American self-interest. There was no American self-interest in getting involved in Asia, and that's going to be my theme. That World War II, the signing over of the Korean people to slavery at the hands of Imperial Japan was totally avoidable and was only done to protect the Philippines, and it didn't even succeed in doing that. And that Dean Acheson, through his own criminally incompetent bunglings, provokes the war with Japan, which FDR never even wanted, and gets sucked into. FDR did feel the need that war was inevitable, but with Nazi Germany, his policy was precisely to avoid war with Japan, because the primary threat he felt to America ultimately, as well as Europe, but to the American people, was from the Nazis and the fascist Nazi sweeping of the world across the Atlantic. And Dean Acheson screws that up. And then Dean Acheson and MacArthur, between them, nearly bring the world into nuclear annihilation over Korea. And then we have Vietnam, which is another total mess. And then we have Nixon and Kissinger, who are intelligent, who up here in their heads know better, but they're cynical and they don't have the political guts to wind up the war in 1968-69. So another 30 or 40,000 American soldiers have to die, and another 1.5 million or so Vietnamese civilians have to die, just so that Nixon can say he didn't lose the war.
Don't spoil all the punchlines, Marty. But this is going to be
I'll
good.
come up with more. Look, I'm a tabloid man. You know that. I'll come up with more.
I'm looking forward to that. Oh my God.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. So much.
All right, guys. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you, Marty. And see you guys
Thank you,
next
Magdalena.
week.
Thank you.
Happy Easter.
Thank you so much.
See you guys.